3 weeks after the betrayal, almost everyone in the underworld had already decided that Dante Rossi was a dead man who had not yet been buried. The doctors at St. Catherine's Medical Center never said it that directly. Men like Dante Rossi were given softer words, cleaner lies, more careful euphemisms. But every report meant the same thing. His brain activity was barely a whisper on the monitors. His body, once capable of breaking men with his bare hands, could not even draw breath without machines. And the chance of him returning as the Alpha who had once ruled the Valachi crime family, the man they called the Iron Alpha, was so astronomically small that even the most optimistic surgeons had stopped pretending to hope. He lay in the center of room 804, a private suite sealed behind keycard locks and bulletproof glass. Monitors glowed beside him in the dark, casting pale blue light across his unmoving face. The ventilator rose and fell in a rhythm that did not belong to him. Mechanical, cold, borrowed time from a machine that had no stake in whether he lived or died. To the city of Verona Heights, Dante Rossi was death made flesh. His name made rival bosses lower their voices. His decisions could move money, weapons, and fear through entire districts before dawn. He had buried enemies alive and smiled at their funerals. He had never lost a war, never shown weakness, never, not once in 15 years as the head of the Valachi organization, allowed anyone to see him bleed. But inside that room, he was only a silent body beneath a dark hospital gown. His hands, which had signed death warrants and held the throats of traitors, rested powerless against white sheets. His face, which had made grown men weep with a single glance, was slack and empty. And the men who had once knelt before him were already measuring the distance between his last breath and their own ambition. No one entered room 804 because they loved him. Doctors came to record numbers, heart rate, brain activity, oxygen saturation, and left without looking at his face. Lawyers came to prepare documents, their briefcases heavy with succession plans and asset transfer forms. Members of the Valachi family came with lowered eyes and careful expressions, not to mourn their fallen dawn, but to confirm with their own eyes how much time remained before the throne became empty. Even the guards outside his door no longer looked like soldiers protecting a king. They looked like men assigned to watch over something expensive until the owner stopped existing, at which point the expensive thing would be divided among the vultures circling above. The only person who came without wanting anything from him was Micah Chin. Micah worked the night cleaning shift at St. Catherine's. He was 24 years old, an Omega with a small child at home, and he moved through the hospital's corridors like a ghost, present but unnoticed, necessary but invisible. To most people on the 8th floor, he was part of the building rather than a person inside it. He pushed his cart of fresh linens, disinfectant spray, gloves, and trash bags with a quiet efficiency that had taken him years to perfect. His head stayed low enough to avoid questions, but not so low that anyone could accuse him of hiding something. He was a shadow, and shadows did not get fired. His life was balanced so tightly between rent, medicine, and food that one missed shift could make everything collapse. He knew this the way other people knew their own birthdays, as an immutable fact, a date carved into stone. His son Leo was 3 years old, born during the worst winter Micah had ever lived through. The boy's father had been a brief mistake. An alpha who had smelled Micah's heat across a crowded bar decided he wanted something that was not his to take. Micah never reported him. He never told anyone. He simply took the pregnancy that followed and raised the child alone, because that was what Omegas in his position did. They survived silently, and they did not make trouble. The cheap suppressors he bought from a pharmacy in the bad part of town kept his biology manageable most of the time. They left him tired, sometimes nauseous, always slightly hollow, but they worked. Or they worked well enough. His body had learned to live on half doses stretched across too many days, and Micah had learned to ignore the headaches, the dizziness, the way his sense sometimes leaked through despite his best efforts. The first time Micah entered Dante Rossi's room, he was afraid enough that his fingers tightened around the spray bottle until his knuckles hurt. He had heard the whispers. Nurses talked in break rooms when they thought the cleaning staff did not understand English. Guards exchanged dark jokes about what they would do if the dawn ever woke up. Doctors spoke in hushed tones about bullet fragments pressing against the Alpha's brainstem, about hemorrhages that should have killed anyone else, about the statistical impossibility of meaningful recovery. Dante Rossi was not just a patient. He was the head of the Valachi family. He was the kind of alpha other alphas feared, the kind who had reportedly killed his own father to take control of the organization, who had ordered hits on 3 rival bosses in a single night, who had never left a witness alive to testify against him. Even unconscious, even surrounded by tubes and wires and the antiseptic smell of the hospital, he carried a pressure in the room that made Micah want to finish quickly and leave before anyone noticed how fast his heart was beating. For the first few nights, Micah barely looked at him. He wiped the rails, changed the trash, cleaned the glass, and left with the same careful silence he used everywhere else in the hospital. He did not speak to the unconscious Alpha. He did not even think about him beyond the necessary caution of being near a dangerous man. He came, he worked, he left. That was the routine. But silence had a strange weight in room 804. After several nights of seeing no visitors sit beside the bed, no hand straighten the blanket with tenderness, no voice speak to Dante as if he were still human, Micah found himself slowing down. It was not curiosity, exactly. It was something closer to recognition. He knew what it felt like to be alone in a room full of people. He knew what it felt like to be looked at but not seen. And there was something about the way the Alpha lay there, surrounded by machines that beeped and whirred and breathed for him, that made Micah's chest ache in a way he did not want to examine too closely. One night, while rain tapped softly against the window, Micah murmured without meaning to, "It rained again today. Leo thinks thunder is the sky getting angry because someone stole its dinner." The machines answered with their steady beeping. Dante did not move, but saying the words made the room feel less like a tomb and more like a place where a person might exist. Micah glanced toward the bed, embarrassed by his own foolishness, then continued wiping the bedside table. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself the Alpha could not hear him, would not remember even if he could, and that talking to an unconscious man was no different from talking to himself, something he did often, because 3-year-olds were not great conversationalists. After that, talking became easier. Every night, when the guards stopped paying attention and the nurses were busy with other patients, Micah would speak in a low voice while he cleaned. He told Dante about Leo, his little boy who drew crooked stars on old receipts and insisted that broken toys only needed better names. He named his missing socks Steve, Micah said one night, shaking his head. "Now he asks me where Steve is every morning. I have to tell him Steve went on vacation." He spoke about the heater in their apartment that worked only when it wanted to, about the landlord who always came when Micah had the least money, and about the suppressors that had become so expensive he sometimes cut doses in half and prayed his body would forgive him for it. He did not know why he was telling these things to a comatose Mafia boss. Maybe because Dante could not judge him. Maybe because the Alpha's silence felt less like indifference and more like permission. "You probably had people handle all your problems before they ever reached you," Micah said once, folding a clean blanket near Dante's feet. "But I guess that doesn't mean you were happy. People don't look this lonely by accident." He regretted the words as soon as they left his mouth. It was dangerous to speak honestly around a man like Dante Rossi, even if that man could not open his eyes. But the confession stayed between them, held safely by the machines in the darkened room, and Micah returned the next night despite knowing he should not become attached to a patient everyone had already given up on. Deep inside the place where Dante's mind had sunk, Micah's voice was not clear at first. It came through the emptiness like warmth pressing against ice, soft and persistent, never demanding anything from him, never calling him Don or Sir or any of the titles that had defined his entire adult life. The voice did not ask for money or power or protection. It did not calculate angles or measure loyalty or try to determine whether he was still useful. It simply spoke night after night about a child who drew crooked stars in a heater that did not work and the quiet exhaustion of a life barely held together. Dante could not move toward the voice. He could not answer it. He could not even understand all the words. But whenever that voice faded, The darkness around him became colder. The emptiness pressed closer. And something deep inside him, something the doctors had written off as irreparably damaged, held on. The doctors believed there was no meaningful response in him. They did not know that the dead alpha they were preparing to abandon was holding on to the sound of an omega who treated him like a person. They did not know that Micah, unknowingly, was keeping Dante from slipping further away with nothing more than stories about a missing sock named Steve. Across the city, Victor Pavlenko prepared to end what the bullets had failed to finish. Victor was Dante's second-in-command, the man the organization trusted to protect the Valachi family until its leader recovered or died. 12 years earlier, Dante had pulled him out of an underground ABO fighting ring, a place where alphas were forced to battle each other for the entertainment of wealthy spectators, and had given him a place beside him. Victor had been 17, bloodied, broken, and so full of rage that he could barely see straight. Dante had looked at him and said, "You can die here killing for strangers, or you can come with me and kill for family." Victor had chosen family, or he had thought he did. But gratitude curdled slowly year after year, as Victor spent his entire adult life standing behind the one man no one could surpass. He was strong. He was loyal. He was capable. But he was not the Iron Alpha. He would never be the Iron Alpha. And the knowledge of that had settled into his bones like poison, spreading quietly until there was almost nothing left of the boy Dante had saved. In a private office far from the hospital room, Victor listened as a senior doctor explained that the medical committee had reached its conclusion. There was no realistic chance of recovery. The bullet fragments had caused irreversible damage to the brainstem, and if the legal authority approved, life support could be withdrawn within 48 hours. Victor lowered his gaze to the documents, as if the decision pained him. His jaw tightened. His hands rested motionless on the table. To anyone watching, he looked like a man grieving the imminent loss of his closest friend. Then he signed with a steady hand. "We should not force him to suffer," he said, and his voice was calm enough to fool anyone who wanted to believe in loyalty. That same night, Micah finished his shift in room 804 later than usual. His body ached. His suppressor was wearing thin. He could feel it in the way his skin had grown warmer, the way his scent had started leaking more noticeably despite his best efforts. He had pushed the half-dose too far, stretched it across too many days, and now his biology was beginning to rebel. He knew Leo would be asleep by the time he got home. His mother, who watched the boy during Micah's night shifts, would have already put him to bed with a story and a glass of warm milk. Micah would let himself into the dark apartment, check on his sleeping son, and collapse into his own bed for a few hours before starting the whole cycle again. But he still paused beside Dante's bed before leaving. The thought of never speaking to this silent alpha again made his chest feel tight. It was irrational. It was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of emotional attachment that had gotten him into trouble before, with men who had promised to stay and then vanished the moment things got hard. And yet, "Leo asked about you today," Micah whispered, his hand resting lightly on the cleaning cart. "I told him you were sleeping. He said scary-looking people probably make the best shields, so if you ever wake up, I think he'd like you." He smiled at his own words, a tired, sad smile that did not reach his eyes. "The last thing he told me to tell you was that Steve says hello. I don't know what that means either. But apparently Steve is very concerned about your health." The monitor continued its rhythm. The ventilator rose and fell. Dante did not move. Micah gave a small shrug, more for himself than for the unconscious alpha, and turned to go. Then the sound changed. It was only a small, irregular jump at first, so slight that Micah almost convinced himself he had imagined it. A blip on the heart monitor, a flicker of something that did not quite match the mechanical pattern that had been steady for weeks. He stopped walking. His hand tightened on the cart. When he turned back toward the screen, the line moved again. Fragile, unsteady, but there. A pulse of activity that had not been there before. Micah stood frozen beside the bed, the empty room suddenly feeling as if something inside it had heard him, and was trying, with all the strength it had left, to answer. Micah barely slept after seeing the monitor react. For the rest of the night, the image stayed trapped in his mind like something he was afraid to touch too closely in case it disappeared. Every logical part of him insisted it had probably been a machine error, a meaningless reflex from a dying body, a coincidence that meant nothing at all. But another part of him could not forget the timing. The monitor had changed only after he spoke to Dante. Only after he mentioned Leo. Only after he said, "If you ever wake up, I think he'd like you." The next evening, Micah returned to St. Catherine's carrying a feverish child against his chest. Leo had started coughing before dawn. By morning, his small body was burning with a fever that made Micah's hand shake every time he touched his son's forehead. He had spent hours trying everything he could think of: cold towels, diluted medicine, warm soup the boy barely touched. But the fever only climbed higher. The cheap clinic near their apartment refused treatment without payment up front. The pharmacist downstairs looked almost apologetic while explaining that the medication Leo needed cost more than half of Micah's remaining savings. By sunset, Micah's body was trembling from exhaustion and stress. His suppressor had nearly stopped working entirely, leaving a faint sweetness leaking into the air around him, no matter how carefully he tried to hide it. He hated that smell when he was struggling. It made him feel exposed, weak, too easy for the world to notice. At 8 in the evening, his phone rang. The convenience store manager did not even let Micah explain properly before cutting him off. "If you miss another shift, don't bother coming back tomorrow." The call ended before Micah could answer. For a long moment, he simply stood in the narrow apartment kitchen, staring at the cracked screen of his phone while Leo whimpered weakly from the couch behind him. Outside, rain hammered against the windows, hard enough to shake the frames. Micah closed his eyes. He had already lost one job this month because Leo got sick too often. Rent was overdue. His suppressors were nearly gone. And now the store job was gone too, and Leo was burning up in his arms, and Micah had no idea what to do. By midnight, desperation pushed him somewhere pride never would have allowed. Not the emergency room. Micah already knew he could never afford that bill. Instead, he entered St. Catherine's through the employee service entrance, with Leo wrapped tightly in blankets against his chest. The little boy's face was flushed with fever, his breathing uneven, his small hands clinging weakly to Micah's hoodie. The basement corridors smelled like bleach and steam. Micah moved quickly past laundry carts and supply rooms, trying not to draw attention. He found an empty corner behind stacked linen bins and sat there for almost 20 minutes, rocking Leo while whispering soft reassurances into his hair. "It's okay," he murmured quietly. "Daddy's here." Just a little longer. But Leo kept crying. Not loudly at first, just weak, painful little sounds that became sharper every few minutes as the fever worsened. Micah's panic rose slowly with each noise. If the night supervisor found him hiding a child inside the hospital, he would lose his cleaning position immediately. Then they would truly have nowhere left to go. His eyes lifted toward the service elevator at the end of the hall. The 9th floor. Room 804. The warmest room in the building. Micah hated himself for even considering it. It was insane. It was dangerous. It was the kind of decision that could get him arrested or worse. But exhaustion and fear eventually crushed the last of his hesitation. He stood slowly, adjusted Leo higher against his chest, and stepped into the elevator before he could change his mind. The 9th floor was quiet when the doors opened. The guards outside Dante's suite were distracted by a sports broadcast on one of their phones. They barely glanced at Micah as he pushed his cleaning cart toward the room. To them, he was invisible again. Just another worker doing another late-night shift, no different from the walls or the floors or the humming fluorescent lights. The moment the door closed behind him, Micah finally let out the breath he had been holding. The room was dim, lit only by the pale blue glow of the monitors beside Dante's bed. The Alpha remained exactly as before, motionless beneath white sheets, the ventilator breathing in slow mechanical rhythm beside him. His dark hair had grown longer during the weeks of Hunmi, falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger. Less like a monster. More like a man who had simply stopped. I'm sorry, Micah whispered immediately, though he was not even sure who he was apologizing to anymore. I just need somewhere warm for a little while. I promise I'll leave before anyone notices. Leo whimpered harder in his arms. Micah sat in the chair near the bed and tried to soothe him, but the fever made the child restless and miserable. Leo tossed weakly beneath the blankets, small hands clutching helplessly at Micah's shirt while tears slid down his flushed cheeks. Daddy's here, Micah kept repeating softly. It's okay. Please calm down a little. But nothing worked. With every passing minute, Micah became more aware of how dangerous the situation was. If a nurse heard crying inside the VIP suite, questions would come immediately. Then footsteps. Then security. Then the end of everything. Panic tightened in Micah's chest until breathing itself became difficult. The stress triggered another wave of unstable pheromones. Sweet Omega scent spilling heavier into the room despite the failing suppressor in his system. He pressed a shaking hand against his mouth, trying desperately to calm himself before instinct completely overwhelmed him. That was when his eyes landed on Dante's chest. The thermal blankets covering the Alpha kept the bed warm to support circulation. Heat radiated faintly from beneath the sheets, steady and constant, even in the cold room. It was body heat, real and alive, the kind of warmth that Micah had not felt from another person in years. He hesitated. Then slowly, carefully he stood. I'm sorry, he whispered again. With trembling care, he lowered Leo onto the broad chest of the unconscious Alpha. The effect was immediate. Leo's crying weakened almost instantly as the warmth surrounded him. The child curled instinctively against Dante's body, tiny fingers clutching weakly at the fabric of the hospital gown. Within seconds, his ragged breathing began slowing into softer, more even breaths. The tension in his small face eased. His eyes fluttered closed. Relief hit Micah so hard it nearly made his knees give out. But then the monitors changed. A sharp, irregular beep cut through the silence. Micah's head snapped toward the screen. The heart monitor had shifted from its dull, artificial rhythm into something stronger, uneven at first, then faster, more responsive. The brain activity monitor flickered. Once, twice. Then the line spiked hard enough to trigger alarms across the room. Micah stumbled backward in shock, just as the suite doors burst open. Two nurses rushed inside with a resident doctor close behind them. What happened? The doctor demanded, staring at the monitors. He's crashing, one nurse said urgently, already reaching toward the emergency cart. Another nurse moved quickly toward the bed and froze. There's a child here. The room exploded into confusion. Get the boy away from the patient, the resident ordered immediately. The nurse reached down toward Leo, and suddenly a hand locked around her wrist. The entire room went still. Micah's breath stopped. Dante's fingers tightened with terrifying strength around the nurse's arm as the machine screamed around him. Then his eyes opened. Cold, sharp, fully aware. He did not look at the doctors. He did not look at the alarms. His gaze fell directly onto the small child curled against his chest, and then slowly to the Omega standing frozen against the wall. His voice, rough from weeks of silence, filled the room. Don't, he rasped softly. Touch him. For several seconds after Dante opened his eyes, nobody in room 804 moved. The alarms continued screaming through the suite while the nurse remained frozen beneath the crushing grip around her wrist. The resident doctor stared at the monitors in open disbelief, his face drained of color as brain activity readings climbed higher and higher across the screen. 3 weeks. 3 weeks without meaningful response. And now the man everyone had already prepared to bury was awake and fully conscious. Micah stood near the wall with his heart pounding, so hard it hurt. He should have felt relieved. Instead, fear mixed violently with shock inside his chest, because the Alpha watching the room did not look weak or confused. Dante looked dangerous. Even lying half-connected to machines, even with his body still weak from weeks of atrophy, his presence filled the entire suite with suffocating pressure. His dark eyes moved slowly from the nurse to the trembling Omega standing nearby, then finally settled on the small child sleeping against his chest. Only then did his grip loosen. The nurse stumbled backward immediately, clutching her wrist and breathing hard. Nobody tried touching Leo again. The doctor recovered first. "Mr. Rossi, you've suffered severe neurological trauma. You need to remain calm while we examine." "No." Dante's voice came out rough from disuse, but the authority inside it cut through the room instantly. Speaking clearly cost him visible effort. Micah saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his throat worked around each word, yet somehow that only made him more intimidating. His hand shifted protectively over Leo's small back. The child had fallen asleep completely during the chaos, curled trustingly against the alpha's chest as though he belonged there. The doctor hesitated, then tried again more carefully. "The boy has a high fever. We need to move him so we can provide treatment." Dante's eyes sharpened immediately. No one touches him. This time, nobody argued. Micah could barely process what he was seeing. The doctors had described Dante as nearly brain dead less than 24 hours earlier. Now the same man was glaring at medical staff like a predator, deciding whether they were threats. His body was clearly failing him. Micah could see the tremor in his arms, the way his breathing was too fast, the sweat beading on his forehead from the effort of staying conscious, but none of that mattered. The alpha's presence alone was enough to silence an entire room. Then Dante looked directly at him. The air left Micah's lungs. Those sharp eyes settled fully on him for the first time, not vaguely or instinctively like before, but with clear, deliberate awareness. There was exhaustion in Dante's face and pain, and beneath both something else. Recognition. Strong enough to make Micah's stomach tighten. "You," Dante said quietly. Just one word. But Micah understood immediately. The alpha knew his voice. He knew the stories about Steve the missing sock and the crooked stars and the heater that never worked. He knew, somehow, that Micah had been the one speaking to him in the dark. The realization sent a strange rush of heat through Micah's body, made worse by the unstable suppressor already struggling inside his system. He could feel his own pheromones leaking more heavily now, sweet and uncontrolled, responding to something he did not fully understand. "I should go," Micah managed weakly. Dante's gaze darkened almost immediately. "No." The answer came too fast, too instinctive. Everyone in the room noticed it. The nurses exchanged glances. The doctor's eyebrows rose. Even the guards outside, who had crowded into the doorway at the sound of alarms, shifted uncomfortably. The silence afterwards stretched awkwardly until the resident doctor finally cleared his throat and motioned for the nurses to continue working around the bed. Over the next hour, the hospital descended into complete chaos. Senior doctors flooded the floor. Security tightened across the entire wing. Calls moved through the city faster than wildfire. By dawn, every important figure connected to the Valachi family already knew the impossible truth. The Iron Alpha had returned. But inside room 804, Dante seemed focused on only three things: the Omega, the child, and the scent lingering softly in the air around them. The doctors eventually convinced Dante to allow Leo to receive treatment, but only after setting up a portable bed beside his own. Even then, Dante watched every movement with cold suspicion, his eyes tracking every nurse who came near the child, his body tensing every time someone reached for a thermometer or an IV line. "Just let them help him," Micah said quietly. After the third time, Dante had almost grabbed a nurse's wrist. "Please. He needs medicine." Dante's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he did not respond. Then, slowly, deliberately, he relaxed his grip on the bedsheet, though his eyes never stopped watching. The medication lowered Leo's fever within hours. The child slept peacefully after that, his small face finally losing its worried crease, his breathing evening out into the soft rhythm of genuine rest. Every time Micah looked at his son, he felt a wave of gratitude so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. Micah remained near the corner of the room the entire time, tense and exhausted. Part of him wanted to leave immediately, Before more Valachi members arrived, before anyone thought to ask why a hospital cleaner had been hiding in a VIP suite with a feverish child, another part of him could not bring himself to walk away. Not after everything that had happened. Not after Dante had looked at him like he mattered. Around sunrise, the room finally became quiet again. Most of the staff left after finishing examinations, though armed guards now stood both inside and outside the suite. Dante had removed the oxygen mask despite repeated complaints from doctors, and while his body still looked weakened from weeks in bed, the force of his presence seemed to grow stronger every hour he stayed awake. Micah tried not to stare. It became difficult not to, when Dante's attention kept returning to him. "You're afraid of me," the Alpha said suddenly. Micah looked up in surprise. Dante was watching him from the bed with unreadable eyes, dark and tense, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. Micah hesitated before answering honestly. "I think everyone's afraid of you." For the first time, something almost resembling amusement flickered briefly across Dante's face. "But you still talk to me." Micah lowered his eyes immediately. "You looked lonely." The answer seemed to affect Dante more than Micah expected. The Alpha went silent after that, his gaze drifting slowly toward the sleeping child nearby. The room remained still for several long moments before he finally spoke again, quieter this time. "Nobody talks honestly around me." Micah did not know how to answer that, because it was true. Even now, doctors and guards and Valachi members kept watching Dante carefully, measuring every reaction before speaking, weighing every word for potential consequences. Nobody relaxed near him. Nobody forgot what kind of Alpha he was. But Micah remembered the man lying unconscious beneath cold hospital lights while everyone waited for him to die. And somehow that version of Dante felt harder to fear. Late that afternoon, another problem appeared. Micah's suppressor completely wore off. He noticed the symptoms immediately. His body temperature rose too quickly, flushing his skin with heat that had nothing to do with the room temperature. A faint sweetness spread through the air around him, stronger than before, more insistent, the kind of omega pheromones that were impossible to ignore. His heart rate climbed. His hands began to shake. Panic hit him almost instantly. Not here. Not near a dominant Alpha. Not in a room full of people who would smell exactly what was happening to him. Micah stood abruptly from his chair, avoiding eye contact. "I need to leave." Dante's gaze sharpened at once. "Why?" "It's nothing. I have to go." The Alpha inhaled once, slowly. Then his expression changed. Micah's pheromones were unstable, frayed badly from stress, exhaustion, and cheap suppressors pushed far beyond safe limits. To another Omega, the scent might have only seemed sweeter than usual. To Dante, it smelled wrong, damaged, like something that had been broken and then poorly glued back together, held by nothing but hope and desperation. Dante's voice lowered dangerously. "Who gave you those suppressors?" Micah froze. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." The pressure in the room shifted instantly. Even the guards near the door straightened nervously as Dante's alpha pheromones thickened beneath his words, not directed at Micah exactly, but present in a way that made the air feel heavier. His scent was dark and cold, like winter air before a storm, and it wrapped around Micah's leaking omega pheromones with an intensity that made his knees weak. Micah swallowed hard. "They're all I can afford." The silence afterward felt heavy. Dante stared at him for several seconds, his dark eyes unreadable, his jaw tight. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, but no less intense. "From now on, you won't use them anymore." Micah blinked in confusion. "What?" "I'll replace them." "No, you don't need to." "I said I will." The authority in Dante's voice made refusal feel impossible. Micah's chest tightened unexpectedly at the words. Nobody had ever said something like that to him before, with such certainty, such finality, as if his suffering was not normal and should never have happened in the first place. Before Micah could respond, Leo stirred weakly in a portable bed beside them. Almost instantly, Dante's attention shifted. The alpha leaned forward carefully despite obvious pain, his body protesting the movement even as he made it, and adjusted the blanket around the sleeping child with surprisingly gentle movements. Leo relaxed again within seconds. His tiny fingers, searching unconsciously for something to hold, curled around two of Dante's larger ones. Micah watched the scene quietly. Something about it felt dangerous in a completely different way now, not because Dante frightened him, but because the room no longer felt cold when the alpha looked at them. That night, Micah stayed later than he should have, and when exhaustion finally caused him to drift to sleep in the chair beside the bed, he never noticed the moment Dante carefully pulled a blanket over his shoulders before settling back against the pillows, eyes fixed silently on the Omega sleeping within arm's reach. By the fourth day after Dante woke up, the atmosphere inside St. Catherine's had changed completely. Doctors still entered room 804 with careful professionalism, but now there was tension beneath every movement. Valachi family members began appearing on the 9th floor again, dressed in dark suits and speaking in low voices outside the suite. Nurses avoided eye contact whenever Dante looked their way. Even the guards stationed inside the room carried themselves differently now that the man they had expected to bury was sitting upright in bed, watching everything around him with cold awareness. But the biggest change was not the hospital. It was Dante himself. Micah noticed it most during the quiet moments. The alpha barely slept unless Micah and Leo were nearby. Whenever Micah stepped out of the room for too long, to get coffee, to call his mother, to use the bathroom, the atmosphere inside the suite grew noticeably heavier. The air thickened with alpha pheromones, restless and sharp, and the guards would shift uncomfortably until Micah returned. Dante never openly asked him to stay, but his eyes always followed Micah back toward the door with the same dark intensity every time he tried to leave. And Micah was beginning to understand something dangerous. Dante's instincts had attached themselves to them. At first, Micah tried convincing himself it was temporary, just lingering alpha protectiveness caused by the unusual circumstances of Dante's recovery. Maybe it was a trauma response or a side effect of the brain injury, or something that would fade once the alpha was back on his feet and running his empire. But the signs kept growing stronger. Dante refused to let unfamiliar alphas enter the room alone while Micah was present. He memorized the exact times Micah's suppressors needed replacing and became visibly irritated whenever the Omega skipped meals from stress. He asked about Leo's favorite foods, his bedtime routine, his fears and his joys, and he remembered every single answer. Even Leo had started climbing naturally onto Dante's bed during the evenings, curling against the alpha's side as though he had known him much longer than a few days. The strangest part was how natural it all began to feel. That frightened Micah more than anything. Late one evening, Micah stood near the sink washing fruit for Leo, while the little boy sat cross-legged beside Dante on the hospital bed, drawing crooked stars across a napkin. The sight should have looked absurd. One of the most feared alphas in the city, a man who had reportedly killed his own father, who had ordered hits on rival bosses, who had never shown weakness in 15 years of ruling the Valachi family, was sitting silently with a child balanced against his arm, listening with complete focus to a long explanation about why stars should always have smiling faces. Yet somehow, Dante looked calmer than Micah had ever seen him. "You made the eyes uneven again," Leo complained seriously. Dante glanced down at the drawing, then fixed them. "That's because you're bad at this." A quiet huff of amusement left the alpha. It was small, barely there, but it was still laughter. Micah froze slightly at the sound. His hands stopped moving over the fruit. In all the weeks he had spent in this room, he had never heard Dante make any sound even close to amusement. The alpha's reputation was built on silence and violence, not warmth or humor. But here now, with a 3-year-old criticizing his artistic skills, Dante Rossi had almost laughed. For a moment, the room felt warm enough that Micah almost forgot who Dante really was. Then the lights went out. The entire suite dropped into darkness so suddenly that Leo startled against the bed. A second later, emergency red lights flickered on across the room, dim and urgent, casting everything in shades of crimson and shadow. Every instinct inside Micah tightened immediately. Something was wrong. Outside the door, shouting erupted through the hallway. One of the guards cursed sharply into his radio before a gunshot cracked through the corridor. Leo flinched hard. Micah's heart nearly stopped. "What's happening?" he whispered. Dante was already moving. Ignoring the 4 lines still attached to his arm, he pulled them free and stood from the bed for the first time without assistance. The movement clearly hurt. Micah saw the brief tension in his jaw, the stiffness in his body after weeks of recovery, but none of it slowed him down. The Alpha looked terrifying standing there, barefoot beneath the red emergency lights. Hold. Focused. Awake in a way Micah had not fully understood until now. Another gunshot exploded outside, followed by screaming. The door burst open. One of the guards stumbled inside, bleeding from the shoulder. "Boss," he hissed urgently. They got past security. Behind him, armed men were already moving down the corridor. Leo started crying instantly. Micah grabbed the child and backed away from the door, panic surging violently through his body. His pheromones reacted almost immediately. Sweet omega scent flooding the room as fear pushed his already weakened system toward collapse. The reaction in Dante was immediate. His head snapped toward Micah. Every trace of calm disappeared from the Alpha's face, replaced by something raw and primal and terrifyingly focused. His dark eyes tracked the trembling Omega and crying child, and his entire body shifted, broadening, tensing, positioning itself between them and the door. "Stay behind me," he ordered. The pressure of his dominant pheromones exploded through the suite, hard enough to make Micah's knees weaken, hard enough to make the wounded guard stumble backward, hard enough to fill every corner of the room with the suffocating weight of an Alpha in full protective rage. It was not directed at Micah. It was directed outward. A territorial warning, sharp enough to suffocate, broadcast to every Alpha in the vicinity. "These are mine. Touch them and die." Then the attackers entered. 3 men in black rushed through the doorway, with silenced pistols raised. The first barely crossed the threshold before Dante reached him. Even injured, even weakened from weeks in a hospital bed, the Alpha moved with brutal efficiency that spoke of years of violence honed to instinct. He caught the attacker's wrist, twisted hard enough for bone to crack loudly, and slammed the man into the wall. The gun clattered to the floor. The man followed it, unconscious before he hit the ground. The second attacker raised his weapon toward Micah. Dante's expression changed instantly. Not anger. Not rage. Something colder. Something possessive. The kind of look that promised violence beyond anything the attackers had anticipated. He crossed the distance in seconds and drove the second man into the floor with enough force to shake the room. The gun skidded away beneath the bed. The attacker screamed, one sharp, cut-off sound before Dante's fist connected with his face and ended it. The third attacker grabbed Micah from behind. A blade pressed against his throat. Cold steel, sharp enough to draw a thin line of blood when Micah gasped. "Back off," the man snarled. Leo cried harder. Micah froze. The knife bit deeper, and he felt warmth trickle down his neck. The room became deadly quiet. Dante slowly turned toward them, breathing heavily, now from the strain on his recovering body more than the exertion of the fight. His eyes locked onto the knife against Micah's throat. His pheromones, already thick and suffocating, grew even heavier. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "You touched him," Dante said softly. The attacker tightened his grip nervously. "Stay back, or he..." He never finished the sentence. Dante moved so fast Micah barely saw it happen. One moment the Alpha stood several feet away. The next, the attacker crashed against the wall with his wrist bent at an unnatural angle, the knife clattering to the floor. The scream that followed echoed through the suite, high and desperate, cut off by another brutal impact. Dante shoved Micah behind his back immediately afterward, shielding both him and Leo with his body while staring coldly at the men sprawled across the floor. "Mine," he said quietly. The words sent heat rushing through Micah's chest despite the terror of everything around them. His heart pounded. His hands shook. The thin line of blood from the knife wound trickled down his neck, warm against his cold skin. Dante's gaze never left the attackers. "My family," he continued, voice low and lethal. "No one touches them." Security forces stormed the floor moments later, ending the fight almost as quickly as it had begun. But by then, Micah was shaking too badly to steady his breathing. The fear, the pheromones, the overwhelming alpha pressure surrounding him. Everything crashed together until his body began slipping dangerously close to panic. His heat, the forced adrenaline, the stress, the suppressors that had been failing for days. It all combined into a perfect storm. Heat flooded through his veins, hot and desperate and completely uncontrollable. His knees buckled. Sweet omega pheromones thickened through the room, fast enough that several guards immediately backed away, their own instincts reacting to the overwhelming scent of an omega in distress. "Micah." Dante's voice cut through the haze. "Look at me." Micah tried. He really tried. But his body was spiraling too fast, his vision blurring at the edges, his skin burning with a heat that had nothing to do with fever. Dante stepped closer carefully, his movements slow and deliberate despite the chaos still settling around them. His hands settled against the back of Micah's neck, steady, warm, grounding. The touch sent a shock through Micah's system, his omega instinct screaming at him to lean into the alpha's presence, to submit, to let someone else be in control for once. "Breathe," Dante said quietly. Micah shook his head. I can." Then Dante lowered his head toward Micah's scent gland. The temporary mark happened gently. No violence, no dominance, just the sharp, brief pressure of teeth against the sensitive skin of Micah's throat, followed by a wave of stabilizing alpha pheromones wrapping around his collapsing instincts. Dante's scent flooded through him, dark and cold like winter, but underneath it something warmer, something that felt like safety. The relief hit Micah instantly. His whole body sagged. His knees nearly gave out entirely. Dante caught him before he could fall, pulling him against his chest with an arm wrapped securely around his waist. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Micah could hear the alpha's heartbeat beneath his ear, strong, steady, protective. And for the first time in years, Micah realized he felt safe in someone else's arms. "Stay with me," Dante murmured against his hair. "I've got you." Micah closed his eyes and, for once, let himself believe it. 3 days after the attack at St. Catherine's, Dante Rossi disappeared from the hospital completely. Officially, the doctors protested the decision. His body was still recovering from severe trauma, the bullet fragments, the hemorrhages, the weeks of muscle atrophy. Several specialists insisted he should remain under observation for at least another month. But nobody inside the Valachi family truly had the authority to stop him anymore, especially after the failed assassination attempt had exposed just how unstable the organization had become. By sunrise, Dante, Micah, and Leo were already inside a private penthouse overlooking the river on the far side of Verona Heights. For Micah, the apartment felt unreal. The place was quiet in a way wealth often was, insulated from traffic and noise by thick glass walls and soft lighting. Everything smelled clean, warm, untouched. There were fresh groceries already stocked in the kitchen, folded clothes waiting inside closets, and a bedroom prepared for Leo with shelves full of toys that had clearly been bought overnight by people who had no idea what children actually liked. Leo loved it instantly. The little boy ran from room to room with wide eyes, hugging stuffed animals against his chest while asking excited questions every few minutes. "Can I really sleep here? Can I keep the bear? Can we stay forever?" "Yes," Micah answered softly, still looking around in disbelief. "Forever?" That question made the room go quiet. Micah glanced instinctively toward Dante, unsure how to answer. The alpha stood near the kitchen counter, speaking quietly with one of his men, but his attention shifted toward them the moment he heard Leo's voice. "If you want to," Dante said calmly. Leo grinned so brightly that something strange tightened in Micah's chest. The child ran directly toward Dante without hesitation and wrapped both arms around the alpha's waist. For half a second, Dante looked startled by the sudden contact. Then his large hand settled carefully against Leo's back, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Micah noticed how naturally he did it now. Protecting them had already become instinct. That realization should have scared him more than it did. The first week inside the penthouse passed more peacefully than Micah could remember any part of his life being. Dante assigned security outside the building, discreet men in dark suits who stood watch at the doors and monitored the cameras. But inside the apartment itself, the atmosphere slowly became softer, quieter, warmer. Micah cooked for the first time in a kitchen that actually had enough food. He made soup and pasta, and the kind of simple meals his mother had taught him when he was young. Leo ate everything with enthusiasm, his appetite returning now that the fever was gone. And Dante sat at the table with them, silent but present, watching the way Micah moved around the kitchen like he was memorizing something important. At first, the alpha clearly did not know what to do with domestic silence. Micah would catch him standing motionless in the kitchen at midnight, staring at the refrigerator as though he had forgotten why he entered the room. Sometimes he sat awake on the living room couch long after everyone else slept, eyes fixed on nothing, while old instincts kept his body alert for danger that never came. But little things started changing. Leo dragged him into cartoon marathons on the couch, and Dante endured them without complaint, even when the same episode played 3 times in a row. When Leo caught a minor cold, Micah found Dante quietly researching children's medicine on his phone, cross-referencing dosages and side effects with the same intensity he probably used to plan hits. One evening, Micah walked into the living room and froze at the sight of Dante asleep beneath a blanket, Leo snoring softly against his chest, crayons scattered everywhere across the coffee table. For a man the entire city called the Iron Alpha, Dante looked unexpectedly peaceful like that. His face, usually so cold and unreadable, had relaxed into something almost gentle. His hand rested protectively over Leo's small back. Micah stood there longer than he should have. Then, before thinking too hard about it, he stepped closer and gently brushed dark hair away from Dante's forehead. The alpha woke instantly. Micah jerked his hand back in surprise, but Dante caught his wrist before he could retreat. Their eyes met in the dim light. Neither spoke for several seconds. Dante's thumb moved slowly over Micah's pulse point, feeling the rapid beat beneath his skin. "Sorry," Micah whispered awkwardly. Dante stared at him quietly before answering. "Don't apologize for touching me." The word settled somewhere deep inside Micah's chest and stayed there long after he walked away. But outside the apartment walls, the situation surrounding the Valachi family was becoming uglier every day. Victor Pavlenko had not stopped moving. While Dante recovered, Victor had been consolidating power, securing alliances, and quietly erasing anyone who might oppose his takeover. The failed hospital attack had been a desperate move, one that had failed spectacularly, but Victor was not finished. He had spent 12 years waiting for his chance, and he was not going to let a few bullets and a comatose alpha stand in his way. Dante, meanwhile, had begun uncovering information even he had not fully known while leading the organization. Illegal suppressor manufacturing, underground Omega trafficking routes, auction houses where wealthy alphas purchased vulnerable Omegas like property. The deeper Dante looked, the colder his expression became. His own empire, the thing he had built with blood and violence and 15 years of ruthless ambition, had been profiting from suffering he had never bothered to see. One night, Micah found him sitting alone in the office near the balcony, staring at files spread across the desk. The alpha's jaw was tight, his hands motionless, his eyes dark with something that looked like disgust. "You should sleep," Micah said softly. Dante did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the documents for several long seconds before finally speaking. "I built the system that protected all of this." Micah stepped closer slowly. "You didn't create the whole world. I benefited from it." There was no defensiveness in his voice, only disgust. Micah's gaze drifted toward the papers scattered across the desk, reports, transactions, medical records connected to suppressor experiments that had left Omegas permanently damaged. One file contained photos of bruised bodies. Micah quietly looked away. Dante noticed. His jaw tightened visibly. I never cared enough to look closely before. The honesty in that confession hurt more than denial would have. Micah understood then that Dante's guilt was real. The Alpha was not trying to justify himself. He was realizing piece by piece the kind of world his power had helped sustain. And somehow, instead of frightening Micah, it made him ache for Dante. Because for the first time, the Iron Alpha looked less like a king and more like a man carrying the full weight of what he had become. Late that night, after Leo finally fell asleep, Micah stepped onto the balcony and found Dante standing alone beneath the city lights. The cold wind moved softly through the silence between them. Verona Heights spread out below, a sea of lights and shadows, wealth and poverty, power and desperation. Somewhere down there, people were still suffering. Somewhere down there, Victor was still plotting. For a while, neither spoke. Then Dante said quietly, "The doctors told me I almost died." Micah looked toward him. The Alpha's profile was sharp against the night sky, his jaw, his nose, the dark fall of his hair. Beautiful in a way that felt dangerous to notice. But that wasn't the part that scared me. Dante's voice lowered slightly. What scared me was realizing that the last thing I heard before waking up was your voice. Micah's breath caught. Dante finally turned toward him fully. His dark eyes were unreadable, but something in his expression had shifted, softened in a way that made Micah's chest ache. I kept thinking, he paused briefly, as though unused to saying vulnerable things aloud. If I opened my eyes and you weren't there anymore. The sentence never finished. It did not need to. Emotion tightened painfully inside Micah's chest. For weeks, he had watched this terrifying Alpha slowly become gentler around Leo, quieter around him, softer in moments nobody else saw. This was the first time Dante had spoken about needing them. Not protecting them. Needing them. Micah's eyes burned unexpectedly. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered. Something inside Dante's expression broke at those words. The Alpha looked away briefly, jaw tense, like a man struggling against emotions he no longer knew how to control. His pheromones leaked into the cold air, dark and cold, yes, but underneath, something raw, something vulnerable, something that smelled like fear. Before either of them could speak again, a sleepy voice interrupted. "Daddy." Both of them turned. Leo stood half awake near the balcony door, holding a blanket in his arms. His tired eyes moved between them before settling lazily on Dante. "Daddy, carry me." Silence. Complete silence. Micah froze. His heart stopped. Leo had never called anyone that before. The little boy's biological father had never been the picture, had never wanted to be, and Micah had always told himself that was fine, that they did not need anyone else, that the two of them were enough. But Leo had chosen Dante. Dante looked shattered. The Alpha stared at the little boy like he had been hit directly in the chest. His dark eyes widened. His lips parted. For a long, suspended moment, he did not move at all, as if he was afraid that moving would break the spell, would prove that this was not real. Then, slowly, carefully, he crossed the room and lifted Leo into his arms. The child immediately curled against him without hesitation, small arms wrapping around Dante's neck, face buried against his shoulder. "Night-night," Leo mumbled sleepily. Dante held him tighter. When he finally looked back toward Micah, his eyes were no longer cold. They looked terrified, as if he had suddenly realized just how much these two people meant to him, and how badly losing them would destroy him. Micah crossed the balcony without thinking. He reached up and cupped Dante's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing over the Alpha's cheekbones. Dante's breath caught. His pheromones swirled around them both, dark and cold, and underneath it all, something that smelled like home. "Stay," Dante whispered. Not an order. A request. Almost a plea. Micah leaned up and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, questioning, the kind of kiss that asked permission instead of demanding it. Dante responded immediately, one hand still cradling Leo against his chest, the other coming up to cup the back of Micah's neck. His lips were warm and gentle in a way that contradicted everything Micah knew about him. When they finally broke apart, Micah was trembling. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. Dante closed his eyes. His forehead pressed against Micah's. And for the first time in 15 years, the Iron Alpha let himself feel something other than control. Dante woke before dawn to an empty bed. For half a second, his mind did not understand what felt wrong. Then instinct hit him so violently that his entire body went rigid. The scent of Micah's pheromones lingered faintly in the apartment. Sweet, warm, familiar, but the warmth beside him was gone. So was Leo. Dante was already moving before logic caught up. The penthouse security team met him near the hallway with expressions that told him everything he needed to know. One guard lowered his head immediately. The east cameras went down for 37 seconds. Another handed him a phone. A single message glowed on the screen. "If you want your Omega back, come alone." Warehouse 14. For several long seconds, the apartment became deathly quiet. Then Dante smiled. It was not anger. It was worse. The guards standing nearby instinctively lowered their eyes because every alpha instinct in the room screamed the same warning at once. Something monstrous had just woken up. An hour later, black cars moved through the industrial district toward one of the Valachi family's abandoned shipping facilities near the river. Rain hammered against the windows while the city lights blurred across wet pavement outside. Inside the vehicle, Dante sat completely silent. One of his men finally spoke carefully. "Boss, if Victor really leaked the Omega trafficking records, I know. He'll burn the entire organization down to protect himself." Dante looked out the window without expression. Good. The answer stunned the entire car into silence. Because they finally understood, their boss was not coming back to reclaim the Valachi family. He was coming back to destroy it. Meanwhile, inside the warehouse, Micah struggled weakly against the restraints around his wrists while trying to keep Leo close beside him. The little boy had cried earlier, loud, terrified sobs that had broken Micah's heart into pieces, but exhaustion had eventually forced him into uneasy sleep against Micah's shoulder. His small face was tear-stained, his breathing uneven, and every few minutes he whimpered softly in his sleep. Across the room, Victor stood calmly beside metal crates filled with illegal suppressors and trafficking records. "You changed quickly," he said, almost conversationally. 3 weeks ago, Dante would have burned cities for power. Now he's willing to throw everything away for an Omega and a child. Micah glared at him, his voice hoarse. "You don't understand him at all." Victor's expression darkened faintly. "No, I understand him perfectly." He stepped closer slowly. "That's why I know exactly how to break him." A doctor standing nearby prepared another syringe. The moment Micah smelled the chemicals inside it, panic hit instantly. Heat induction drugs. The kind that forced Omegas into uncontrollable heats, the kind used by traffickers to break their victims. "No," Micah whispered immediately, trying to pull away. "No, please." Victor crouched in front of him. "I need Dante unstable when he gets here. And there's nothing that makes an alpha more unstable than an Omega in distress." The injection burned through Micah's arm seconds later. Within minutes, his body began reacting violently. His breathing turned uneven first. Then came the heat flooding through his veins, hot enough to make his vision blur, hot enough to make his skin feel like it was on fire. Sweet Omega pheromones spread rapidly across the warehouse, thick and desperate and completely uncontrollable, until even the surrounding guards looked uncomfortable. Micah clenched his jaw hard enough to hurt. Not here. Not like this. Not in front of Leo. Leo stirred weakly against him, frightened by the sudden change in scent. "Daddy." Micah pulled him closer, despite his shaking hands. "It's okay," he whispered hoarsely. "Don't look. Close your eyes, baby. Just close your eyes." Then the warehouse doors exploded inward. Gunfire erupted instantly. Valachi guards shouted while bullets tore through metal crates and overhead lights. The room plunged into chaos so fast that several men never even realized what hit them. Through the smoke and flashing emergency lights, through the rain blowing in through the shattered doors, Dante walked in. Micah's breath caught painfully. The alpha looked terrifying. Rain soaked through his black coat. Blood stained one sleeve, not his, from the look of it. His pheromones rolled violently through the warehouse with enough pressure to make weaker alphas stagger backward instinctively. Dark and cold, yes, but underneath, something else. Something primal. Something that smelled like death. But his eyes never left Micah. The moment Dante smelled the forced heat chemicals in the air, the desperate sweetness of an Omega pushed into crisis, something inside him snapped completely. His pheromones darkened. His expression went blank. And every alpha in the room felt it at once. The Iron Alpha had stopped being a man and had become something else entirely. Victor saw it happen too. He smiled, slow and bitter. There's the monster I remember. Several armed men rushed Dante at once. The fight barely lasted seconds. Dante moved through them with terrifying precision, every strike fueled by rage sharp enough to suffocate the room. One attacker crashed through a metal railing. Another hit the ground unconscious before even raising his weapon properly. A third screamed as his arm broke with a sound like snapping wood. The remaining guards began retreating almost immediately. Nobody wanted to face an alpha in full protective rage, especially not Dante Rossi. Victor backed away, slowly while chaos spread around the warehouse. You really destroyed yourself for them, he spat bitterly. For an Omega who should have stayed invisible. Dante finally stopped moving. Rainwater dripped from his dark hair. His chest heaved. His hands were bloody. But his voice, when he spoke, was quiet. No. His gaze shifted toward Micah and Leo, still huddled together against the wall, still terrified, still alive. I became human because of them. Victor's expression twisted violently. He grabbed a gun from one of the fallen guards and aimed directly at Micah. The shot never fired. Dante crossed the distance instantly and slammed Victor against the concrete floor hard enough to crack it beneath him. The weapon skidded away, uselessly. For a moment, Micah genuinely thought Dante might kill him. The Alpha's hand tightened around Victor's throat. Aggression pheromones crushed through the warehouse like a storm, dark and suffocating and absolutely merciless. You were my brother, Dante said softly. Victor laughed bitterly despite struggling to breathe. And I was always second. Pain flickered briefly across Dante's face. Real pain, the kind that came from 12 years of loyalty shattered by betrayal. Then it disappeared, replaced by something colder. When he finally released Victor, it was not mercy. It was finality. Police sirens echoed outside moments later. The Valachi family's remaining operations collapsed across the city all at once. Trafficking routes exposed, illegal suppressor factories raided, every dirty deal dragged into the light. Victor would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. But Dante no longer looked at the empire falling apart around him. He looked only at Micah. The Omega was trembling badly now, body overheating from the forced heat drug still tearing through his system, eyes glassy with pain and fear. Leo clung tightly to him, crying quietly, confused and frightened and too young to understand any of this. Dante crossed the room immediately. The moment Micah touched him, relief crashed through his entire body, so hard that his knees nearly gave out. Dante caught him instantly, pulling both him and Leo against his chest, surrounding them with his warmth and his scent and his presence. You're safe, the Alpha murmured against Micah's hair, voice rough with emotion. I've got you. You're safe. Micah gripped his coat tightly, fingers shaking. Dante. Dante tilted Micah's face upward gently. Their eyes met through the chaos surrounding them. The smoke, the flashing lights, the distant sound of sirens growing closer. Then Micah pulled him down into a desperate kiss. It was nothing like their first kiss on the balcony. This one was trembling and emotional and full of fear and relief and something that felt dangerously close to love. Neither of them could hide anymore. Neither of them wanted to. Dante kissed him back immediately, one hand cradling the back of Micah's neck while his pheromones wrapped around the Omega protectively, soothing, stabilizing, promising things that words could not yet express. I thought, Micah's voice broke. I thought I'd never see you again. Dante rested his forehead against his. You will always see me, he whispered. As long as I'm alive. Then, carefully, deliberately, he lowered his mouth to Micah's scent gland. The permanent mark was not about ownership. It was a promise, a choice, a vow that neither of them would face the world alone again. Dante's teeth pressed gently against the sensitive skin, enough to claim, enough to bond, but never enough to hurt. Alpha pheromones flooded into Micah's system, warm and dark and steady, wrapping around his frayed instincts like a blanket. Micah's whole body relaxed. His heat, still burning through him, suddenly felt less like fire and more like warmth. His Omega instincts, so long denied and suppressed, finally settled into something peaceful. Dante, he whispered. Forever, Dante answered. Months later, the Valachi family no longer existed. The trafficking routes had been dismantled. The illegal suppressor operations had been exposed. Shelters and medical centers funded by Dante's remaining assets quietly opened across Verona Heights for abandoned Omegas and children with nowhere else to go. The man who had once been the Iron Alpha spent most of his days now in quiet domesticity, making breakfast, reading bedtime stories, learning how to be something other than a weapon. And on quiet evenings inside the riverside penthouse, Leo still fell asleep curled between them on the couch, while Micah rested against Dante's shoulder beneath warm city lights. Sometimes Dante still woke from nightmares, reaching instinctively toward empty space, heart pounding, convinced that this was all some cruel dream that would dissolve when he opened his eyes. But now Micah was always there. And every single time, the Omega pulled him back gently with quiet hands and soft kisses until the darkness faded again. You're thinking too loud, Micah murmured one night, tracing lazy patterns across Dante's chest. Dante caught his hand and pressed a kiss to his palm. I'm thinking about how I got here. Here as in this apartment, or here as in alive. Dante's thumb brushed over the bonding mark on Micah's neck, faded now, but still visible, still his. Here as in this. Micah smiled softly. You got here because a 3-year-old told you that scary-looking people make the best shields. Dante huffed a quiet laugh. Steve the sock had a lot to do with it, too. Steve sends his regards. I'll tell him thank you. Leo stirred between them, mumbling something about stars and smiling faces before settling back into sleep. Dante adjusted the blanket over the little boy's shoulders with the same careful gentleness he had shown that first night in the hospital room, the night everything had changed. Micah watched him for a long moment. Then he leaned up and kissed the Alpha's jaw, soft and warm, and full of everything he could not quite put into words. I love you, he whispered. Dante's arms tightened around them both. His voice, when he answered, was rough with emotion. I love you too. Both of you. Forever. And that was the story of how the Iron Alpha, feared by an entire city, betrayed by those closest to him, left to die in a cold hospital room, was saved not by power or money or loyalty, but by the quiet voice of an Omega who refused to treat him like a monster. Dante Rossi had spent most of his life building an empire through fear, only to discover that the one thing strong enough to change him was love, trust, and the small family waiting for him when the darkness finally ended.